Hi everyone, welcome to your mini lecture on social networks. Now, just a brief note, this whole series will be about the theoretical and conceptual aspects to social networks. We will not be discussing social network analysis per se. So while we'll be discussing the concepts of things like density and centrality and things like that, we will not be going into the measurement of those ideas. So the learning objectives of today, we will be talking about generally social network theory and what we're trying to accomplish, the conceptual community versus the network community, various network components, or actually identifying what networks look like and the components that we use to conceptualize a real social network and how we do it in a diagram. And then the 5 rules of Christakis and Fowler. So let's first do a running example here. And this is the Gloucester Pregnancy Pact.
They're barely old enough to drive, but apparently a group of students at this high school think they're old enough to become moms. School officials say 17 girls, none of them older than 16, are pregnant. And it's no coincidence. Officials say they have made a pregnancy pact.
Originally, we took notice of this when there were 10. They are young white women. We understand that some of them were together talking about becoming pregnant, and that being a positive thing for them.
That's left people in this Massachusetts city wondering, what were they thinking?
They're not making rational decisions.
The teens allegedly told school health officials they wanted to have babies at the same time so they could raise them together.
They're all going to end up on welfare. It breaks my heart.
Local lawmakers say the pregnancies are just another sign that the city's sex ed program needs a makeover ASAP. 2 of the school's health officials resigned last month after a fight over distributing birth control. The clinic's doctor and chief nurse wanted to be able to confidentially give students contraceptives. But the hospital that controls funds for the health center is reluctant to approve the plan over concerns about what community members may think. Ross Simpson, The Associated Press.
So the question is, why would these girls decide to take a pregnancy pact or work together, or not work together, but get pregnant? And one of the ideas here is social networks may actually help us understand that and understand why that occurs, right? So let's briefly talk about social network theory. So social networks theory, what we're trying to do is understand human behavior through the social relationships that people have. And there's 2 main components to social network theory. There's the positionality or the structure, and then there's the function, right? And so the structure is where someone sits amongst a collection of individuals, right? So it's where somebody sits within a social network. Just because you're friends with somebody doesn't mean you're friends with that person's friends, right? And so the idea here is that your position can actually influence your behavior, and this is one of the things that social networks try to do, is understand how that position can influence your behavior. And then the function, that's the flow of resources, information, or even things like disease or contagion through a network, right? So what is the thing that flows through that network and can influence your behavior based on your position? And so currently we have this idea of situational inequality, right? So some are better off socioeconomically. So your social economic status either helps or hinders particular behaviors, right? However, in social networks we talk about positional inequality. And some people are better off in terms of where they're located in a social network. Not necessarily the resources they have per se, but because of where they sit, they're able to gain greater access to resources. And so those are the fundamental ideas of social network theory and what we'll be exploring throughout this series of lectures. So let's quickly talk about a community, a conceptual community versus a network community. So in a community or a setting, typically is identified by something like shared characteristics or some shared identity, right? And so at the Gloucester High School, we would identify this community as students of the high school, or the 17 Girls in the Pregnancy Pact might be a community or a setting, and they have various shared characteristics, right? They go to the same school, they have the same mascot, they probably wear shirts with the school's name on them, things like that, that identify somebody as being part of a community. From a network perspective, however, and according to Christakis and Fowler, a network community is defined as a group of people who are much more connected to each other than they are to other groups of connected people found in other parts of a network. So if we take a large social network, a community is groups of people who are more tightly connected with each other than they are with other people. And this will help us start understanding something like the students in the Pregnancy Pact, right? Maybe it's a possibility that they were really tightly connected to each other and not really tightly connected to other people. So what happens in this case is this idea of getting pregnant might flow throughout the network and influence the people in that network without really being distributed outside of the network or outside of the community, because maybe that community is very tightly interwoven. And we'll talk about that more as this lecture continues. So let's talk about the ways that we conceptualize social networks, right? So we have to have a way to represent social networks and the positionality of people and what flows through the network. So the structure and the function of a network. And so here is a representation of a community, right, or a network. This representation is called a sociogram. So this is all the actors and the social ties within a particular community or a setting. And this represents an entire social network, right? And there are various components to each of these that we'll break down. The first component are the actors. Actors are represented by what's called nodes in a community or a setting, right? These nodes can represent things like individuals, they can represent groups, they can even represent organizations, or even higher, they can represent cities. Zachary Neal does research looking at the exchange of resources across cities. And so the city itself is a node in his social networks. The shapes, on the other hand, represent attributes of community actors. So these can be things like, if we're thinking about the Gloucester students, these can be things like, for example, squares represent sophomores, triangles represent juniors, and maybe circles represent seniors, right? So the attributes are various characteristics of people within that setting. And then lines represent social ties. And they represent a connection between a couple of people. So what they do is they can represent a couple of things. One, they can represent simply a relationship or a connection, or what we call a social tie. And that's simply a relationship between two actors, right? They go to the same school, they sit in the same class, maybe they're sisters. It can be a variety of different things. So it's a relationship simply between two actors. A contagion, on the other hand, is actually what flows across those connections, right? So the flow of information, the flow of resources, and in some cases even the flow of diseases, right? And those can be represented also by lines. And this is the structure and the function of the social networks, right? And when I talk about where people sit in a social network, if we look at the circle that's right in the center of the social network, that's the structure, that person is sitting in a particular location and they have relationships with certain other people in the social network. And that position necessarily provides various access to resources and other sorts of power that other positions in the social network don't necessarily have. And then the function is actually what flows through that social network, right? And then finally, directionality is indicated by arrows. And what I mean by directionality is if you're providing a contagion in one direction versus another direction, right? So if the person, the circle in the top right, say, has some sort of STI, sexually transmitted infection, and engages in unsafe sexual activity with the triangle, that direction would go one way, right? That arrow would go one way because it's infecting a contagion going in one direction. And so that directionality can be important later on when we talk about some of this stuff in more detail. So let's take an example of the Gloucester students, right? And this is obviously a fictitious social network and fictitious names. So in this case, the community would be the Pregnancy Pact students, right? The students who took the Pregnancy Pact together. And obviously there's not 17 here. And so the idea here is that they're more connected with each other than they are with other people. And that's what builds a community. The node here is each girl that took the Pregnancy Pact, or each girl that was pregnant, right? And so we have various girls here: Sid, Eve, Kat, Evelyn, so on and so forth. The attributes can be things like you're in school. So again, like I mentioned, maybe triangles are sophomores, squares are juniors, and circles are seniors, or something like that. The connection represents a friendship. So the line represents a friendship. And so each of these girls are friends with different girls in the social network. And then when we talk about a contagion, the contagions are represented by dotted lines in this case. Hopefully you can see those. And so the dotted lines may represent something like a conversation about pregnancy. And what we could do here is we could actually, this is where directionality can come into play. And maybe we could put a direction from Kat toward Kimmy, right? From Kat toward Kimmy. And maybe Kat had talked to Kimmy about becoming pregnant and the benefits of it and how great it is and how it turns you into an adult or whatever, right? So that conversation is going in one direction. However, if Eve and Kat got together and talked mutually to each other about becoming pregnant, there would be reciprocation there. And so there would be two arrows on that. And so that indicates directionality. So now let's take a second and move on. So we just talked about how social networks are represented conceptually with a conceptual model. Now let's talk about Christakis and Fowler and some of the rules that they came up with in terms of understanding social networks. So rule number one is that we shape our networks. And these are based on several different ideas here. One, the idea of homophily. And this idea is the conscious or unconscious tendency to build connections with people who are similar to yourself. Now conscious, you may, say for example, you're traveling and you're studying abroad in Europe, and you find another American, and you know that American speaks English, has a similar background to you, or at least somewhat similar culture, and you feel alone in a culture that's not similar to yourself. You may build a connection with that person because that person shares those characteristics with you, right? So that would be a conscious decision of homophily and a conscious decision to build a connection with that person. Unconscious tendencies, on the other hand, are things like living in a particular neighborhood. And as research shows, neighborhoods are typically segregated by race and segregated by social economic status. And so we're more likely to build connections with people in our neighborhood who are similar to ourselves because similar people live in those neighborhoods, right? So the opportunity there is the opportunity to build connections with those people are just there, right? And that's the idea of homophily. And so we can shape our social networks because of this principle, because of the homophily principle. We can also shape the structure of our network. So we decide how and when to connect with certain people. And they talk about connecting with maybe a weird uncle, right? You may not connect with that person. You may not invite that person to your wedding, for example. So we decide how to connect with those people. And we also decide whether our friends become friends, right? So if we have, say, two groups that are disconnected from each other, we have two separate friendships. Maybe we have a friendship in school, and then we have a friendship network at work. We can decide whether or not those groups interact with one another. We may have a party and invite those mutual groups over and provide the opportunity for them to connect. And this flows into this idea of density, right? We decide the interconnectedness of our relationships. So we decide whether those relationships become more interconnected or if we keep them separate, right? Again, our school network versus our work network. And this leads to this idea of transitivity, what's called transitivity. And transitivity is this idea that three people are all connected to each other, right? So I'm friends with, say, somebody named Dave. Dave's friends with somebody named Steve, and I'm also friends with Steve, right? That's transitivity. If I were not friends with Steve, that would not be a transitive relationship. And what researchers are finding in that are that people who are highly transitive are typically embedded within a single group. So they have a lot of really close friendships with one group of people or a small group of people, and not many friendships outside of that group. Whereas low transitive people are typically the people who bridge diverse groups. So just for fun, sort of take a minute and think to yourself, do you think you're more highly transitive or low transitive? And there's no value judgment in either one of those. Both of those give benefits and costs in your relationships and sort of the resources that you can gain from both of those. Highly transitive groups tend to be very trusting and tend to have very high social support, whereas low transitive groups may not have those things but may have a greater access to resources, for example. Rule number 2, our network shapes us. So the location or the position we hold in a network influences us, right? So let's think about this very sort of weird example of the spread of, let's say, an STI in centrality. So if you're a member of a group of people who have some disease, right, or some contagion, and you're central to this network, meaning you're sort of in the middle of it. Anything that flows through the network has to flow through you. That is not a good position to be in if disease is throwing something like an STI or other diseases flowing through that network, because you're much more likely to get that disease, right? However, if something like resources, like a strong resource is flowing through that network, say you're in the middle of a business coalition, right? And you're the center of a business coalition. That position is going to be really important and have a lot of power. And so the location of those positions is really important. That's what we mean by the structure of a social network. Rule number 3, our friends affect us. So just take a minute and think about some of the things that your close friends do. And ask yourself, do those behaviors affect you? So if your friend all of a sudden starts eating healthy and goes on a diet and starts working out, are you more likely to do the same thing? If your friend starts going out to bars and partying a lot, are you more likely to do that as well? So think about that, right? And the idea here is that for social network analysts, that is true, right? For people who do social networks, those ideas are true. So friendships have certain costs and benefits. And one of the main ideas here, one of the things that people talk about is gang membership, right? If you're a member in a gang and the gang is engaging in potentially negative or illegal behavior, you're more likely to do that as well because you're influenced by your friends. In addition, our friends' affect us as well, and this is rule number 4. Because our friends influence us, and our friends have their own friends, and those friends influence them, that necessarily flows across the network. Now that influence is depleted across multiple friendships, and so by the time it gets to you, it's not quite as strong. And in addition, you have a lot of other friends who influence you as well, right? So that those friendships, the further down the line you get, the less influence those friends have. But they still influence us. And now finally, rule number 5. The social network has a life of its own. Social networks have their own properties that are not perceptible by the individuals within them. And for social network analysts, we can't simply study one particular individual within a social network and understand that social network. We have to study and understand the social network as a whole. And one of the examples that Christakis and Fowler give here is the wave, right? If you've ever been to a sports stadium or a sports event and you see the wave occurring, the wave isn't something that happens through one individual. It's a group process. And so we can't really understand the wave by simply studying one person within the wave. We have to study the wave as a whole and its properties as a whole, right? And that's what social networks are. And the idea here is that these properties are emergent. And what that means is that it's a collection of individual behaviors that creates a social network behavior, right? Or the behavior of the social network. And there's a saying that social network analysts and social network theorists like to use, is that the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. And what that means is a social network, the collection of behaviors, is greater than simply an aggregation of each of those behaviors alone. And that's what this idea of emergence is, or emergent properties, is that this collection of individual behaviors creates something unique in and of itself. So that is our mini lecture today on Introduction to Social Networks. I hope you enjoyed it. By the end of this, you should understand at least a baseline of what social network theory is, the conceptual community versus the network community, various network components, and Christakis and Fowler's rules. Thanks for watching.